So thank you very much, everyone, for joining on a Sunday afternoon. And my name is Dr. Lalit Verma. I happen to be the chief instructor, but believe me, apart from moderating, I have not much role in this course, except introducing people and making some comments. We have with us Dr. Raju, Dr. Dinesh, Anand, Malika, and Dr. Anil Gupta. The beauty of this course and why we keep repeating this course year after year is because the topics covered in this are very, very common, and people, irrespective of whether they do retina or comprehensive or anterior segment surgery, they face this topic. Because if you take any comprehensive eye department, at least 15 to 20% of the outpatient department have some or the other retina issues. So it is very important to understand common things like CSR, like CNVM, diabetic macular edema, and vein occlusions, because these are very, very common scenarios and can present to any ophthalmologist. So purpose of this course is to, make aware of all these common conditions to everybody, and also tell them that how we can manage these courses and achieve good results in this patient. And lastly, we will have surgical aspects also, that how in some of these macular disorders, today's MIVS can yield very good results. So with this brief introduction about the IC and the speakers, we have one renowned speaker from UK, and this is none else than Dr. Bertil D'Amato. He is a consultant ocular oncologist in Moorfield Eye Hospital, an honorary professor of ocular oncology, and he did his stint previously at San Francisco. He was the director of ocular oncology services in the University of California, and he was also consultant at Royal Liverpool Hospital, where he was director of ocular oncology service. And he has a huge number of peer-reviewed articles, more than 200, and so many book chapters and books as a single author also. So we are very privileged, Dr. Bertil, to have you here with us at the 79th annual conference of AIOC. And his area of interest is MOLES, a new algorithm to distinguish choroidal nevi from melanoma. This is a clinical interesting topic, and all of us would love to hear you that what is this algorithm and why is it so important to distinguish, and what can be done in these patients. So I will request Dr. Patel to start sharing, and I will stop at this stage. Over to you, Dr. Patel.
Hello, good morning. I'm delighted to be here. I have submitted a video, so perhaps that can be played.
Manojji, video play kar dijiye. Can we have the video,
Thank
please?
you very much for the invitation. It's a great honor. I would like to speak to you about MOLES, which is an algorithm I've developed to help distinguish choroidal nevi from melanomas. As we all know, early treatment of choroidal melanomas enhances any opportunities we have for saving life, the eye, and vision. But it depends on accurate differentiation from choroidal nevi. I have developed the MOLES algorithm. MOLES stands for mushroom shape, orange pigment, large size, enlarging tumor, and subretinal fluid. So mushroom shape is scored as 0 if it's absent or if there's a dome shape, incipient if there's a bulge through pigment epithelium with early invasion of retina, and 2 if there's a definite mushroom shape with an overhang. Here are some examples of mushroom-shaped tumors. Orange pigment, lipofuscin, is scored as 0 if absent, 1 if present in trace amount, so if you're not sure whether or not it's present, and 2 if there's definite clumps. Orange pigment is present anterior to the pigment epithelium, unlike drusen that are posterior to the epithelium. So orange pigment can be missed if autofluorescence imaging is not performed, or if one does not look at the eye beyond the lesion, here's a lot of orange pigment that has desquamated from the tumor, or if it is not known that orange pigment can actually appear brown or black over amelanotic tumors. It's important not to mistake orange pigment for drusen, which are subpigment epithelial. And also some nevi have got areas of pigment epithelial atrophy so that you can get an appearance of orange pigment, but there's no hyperautofluorescence, and so there's no lipofuscin. Size is categorized as small if the diameter is less than 3 dis diameters and the thickness is less than 1 millimeter. Large if the diameter is more than 4 dis diameters or if the thickness is more than 2 millimeters. And 1 if it's something in between. Enlargement is categorized as 0 if it is confirmed by sequential photography, 1 if there's uncertainty, and 2 if there's definite growth confirmed by sequential imaging. The best way to detect growth is by looking at the margins of the tumor in relation to adjacent landmarks. Here you can see that this edge of the tumor has grown much closer to that retinal blood vessel and that bifurcation. It's not very useful, in my opinion, to measure tumor diameter because you can get photographic distortion that can give a photo that can give a false impression of growth, and also because the tumor can grow in an oblique direction and not where there's the greatest diameter. It's important to take time into account. Here's a tumor that has grown inferotemporally, and has that grown over 21 years or has it grown over 21 months or weeks? Because some nevi grow very, very slowly. And it's also important to take account of age because nevi can grow in the first 2 or 3 decades of life. Some tumors appear out of nowhere. And even though they look just like nevi, it's a bit worrying because you're not sure whether they're nevi or new melanomas. And so I tend to treat these just in case they're melanomas, or else observe very carefully because sometimes they stop growing. Subretinal fluid is categorized as 0 if absent, 1 if present in trace amounts, just detectable on OCT, and 2 if present in large amounts. Intraretinal edema is given a score of 0 because it's a sign of chronicity. And so is this pigment epithelial change that you can sometimes get inferior to a nevus if OCT shows that the retina is flat. That's given a score of 0. Congenital ocular melanocytosis is not included in the MOLS system because all patients should be monitored in any case. And same with melanocytomas. These should be monitored in case malignancy develops, and so they don't need a MOLS scoring system. Here's a variety of melanocytomas. So each of these is given a score of 0, 1, between 0 and 2, and you add up the 5 scores, and then according to the total score, you can categorize the tumor. If the score is 0, that's a common nevus, 1 is a low-risk nevus, 2, high-risk nevus, and if it's more than 2, then that's a probable melanoma. Here's an example of a common nevus with no suspicious features. And according to the College of Optometrists in the United Kingdom, patients should be monitored in the community. Here's another common nevus, a halo nevus with a score of 0. This has got a score of 1 because it's got a large size. Notice how the 5 digits here summarize the 5 different features. This has got a score of 2 because of large size. Another tumor has a score of 2 because of large size. This has got a score of 2 because of definite growth confirmed photographically. And this is a probable melanoma because of large amounts of confluent orange pigment, which is hyperautofluorescent, and serious retinal detachment. This has a score of 4 because of traces of orange pigment. There they are on autofluorescence, large size, and traces of subretinal. With regards to validation, the MOLD scoring system was used to categorize 222 patients who were seen at the Nevis Clinic of Moorfields Eye Hospital. And there were 81 melanomas in that group, and all of these melanomas had a score of more than 2. So there's 100% sensitivity. There were 141 nevi, and 135 had a score of less than 3. So that's a 97% specificity. There were 6 discrepancies, and one could argue as to whether these were really melanomas or not. Another study at Moorfields Eye Hospital looked at 451 choroidal melanomas that were treated for this diagnosis. And all but one of these had a MOLD score of more than 2. There was one that had a score of less than 3. And I'm not sure whether it's the molds that failed or whether there was retinal detachment that was not detected in the imaging or not documented. And this was another study done at Moorfields Eye Hospital, which looked at tumors that were monitored. And in all of these 96 tumors, the growth was detected by photography alone, especially with OCT and autofluorescence imaging, without ultrasonography. There was only one tumor which showed an increase in thickness of 0.7 millimeters on ultrasonography with no feature visible change in color photography or no CT. So that could have been due to measurement variation. Because of COVID, we've really had to change our practice. We've had to shift from hospital-based medicine to virtual clinics, video consultations, working from home, and so on. And the molds has turned out to be extremely useful. We've designed forms to help the referral of patients, but we've also been encouraging the practitioners to attach images with the referrals so that we can diagnose patients who don't need to come to hospital. So in conclusion, MOLDS reminds non-experts of the main features of malignancy. It does not require special equipment. It enables tele-ophthalmology. It avoids unnecessary travel for patients, and it conserves healthcare resources. I'd like to acknowledge my colleagues and my present and past hospitals, and I'd like to thank you for your attention. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Patil, for this very illuminating talk. Any questions by any of the panelists? Anand?
Wonderful, sir. I mean, I was just intrigued by that issue about your, you said it helped you in your COVID practice in this virtual teleophthalmology, this thing. So have, the success that you've had with direct physical examination, has that been replicated in your virtual teleclinics? Because this is critical at this point of time.
Yes, if the pictures are of good quality, then we can make a diagnosis based on the imaging. Our clinic sizes had to be reduced because of COVID. So what we've done, we've created a system whereby if the imaging is no good, patients come to the hospital only for imaging. And then we do a report afterwards. And like that, we have a clinic space to see patients who need to see us.
I was wondering about the ultrasonography. How will you manage that in this, period of time, that component?
We don't need ultrasonography because the tumors that are big can be seen on color photography.
Thank you. Very interesting.
Alika, any question?
I was wondering whether OCT could be used to monitor the dimensions, at least the height, which would be more sensitive than ultrasound maybe.
Exactly, because with ultrasound, you need to have an expert examiner and high quality equipment for very small lesions. Whereas with OCT, if you can see the internal scleral surface, you get an accurate measurement of the thickness, and that's very useful.
Thank you.
Dr. Bertil, out of these 5 parameters, what you have listed as moles, and you have given a score also to it that more than 2 is high risk. Any one of the parameters has more weightage than the others, like anyone which is more, lethal or more important.
Yes, it's very, very rare to have mushroom nevi. And also clumps of orange pigment, in my opinion, are very rare over nevi as well. So orange pigment for me is a very important sign.
Okay, Dinesh, now shall we move on? I think it was a truly illuminating talk, and it has been, the beauty is that this moles concept and algorithm, what Bertil, I think, has told, will be truly useful in day-to-day practice. And since it has been validated, I think the sensitivity is pretty high. Thank you, Dr. Bertil. And I wish you could stay on for a couple of minutes to listen to our speakers in this webinar.
Thank you.
We'll move ahead. We'll move ahead with this common macular disorders. And at the outset, I will request Dr. Raju to share his screen and tell us about this very, very common things like central serous retinopathy and cystoid macular edema. Over to Raju, please.
Yeah, thank you very much, sir, to consider me to be a part of this IC. I'll be speaking to you all regarding very commonly encountered macular pathologies, the CSR and the CME. Let me start with these 2 spotters. Is this a CME or a CSR? This is the spotter number 2. We all know how these patients of CSR and CME present to us. Patients with CSR present with painless loss of vision, while patients of CME may have slight discomfort, pain when they present to us, and they are usually post-surgical patients. So when we ask for a history, have you used steroids? Most of these patients may tell no if you don't ask the correct questions. But if you ask, are you using any skin ointment? Are you using inhalers? Then they come out with the correct answers. One may also have to assess the patient's personality when we are taking the history, look for Cushingoid features, and rule out pregnancy in a female patient. We're all very familiar with the clinical findings of CSR, which presents with a neurosensory detachment. We may see PEDs and RPE mottling, while patients with CME present with a blunted foveal reflex, and we may be able to pick up the foveal cyst on 90T examination. Coming back to this spotter, this patient was referred to us as CSR, and when we did an indirect ophthalmoscopy, this patient actually had a retinal detachment, and the fluid was extending beyond both the arcades, and the inferior detachment was also seen along with the break. So the clue here is to look for a corrugated appearance. So if at all you see a corrugated appearance, then it indicates that this patient has a shallow retinal detachment. So it's very important that we do an indirect ophthalmoscopy in these patients before we order an OCT, because if we miss a retinal detachment, we may be doing harm to the patient. However, there are types of CSR which extend beyond the arcades. These are called as the atypical CSR. This is a patient who was treated as an exudative retinal detachment with steroids. This patient turned out to be a patient of a multifocal CSR, and all we had to do was to stop steroids in this patient, and this patient did well. Coming to the second spotter, again, this patient was referred to us as a CSR, but when we looked at the disc, this patient had an optic disc pit. So as soon as you make a diagnosis of CSR, it's important that we have a look at the disc and rule out an optic disc pit in these patients, because they may appear very similar when we are doing a clinical examination. Other commonly encountered are these patients who present or are suspected as CSR. When we do a OCT in these patients, we see that there is not only a serous detachment but also elevation at the choroidal level. Now, what are these cases? What should you do next in these patients? Should you do an OCT in these patients? Well, the next examination in these patients is to do a good slit lamp examination to rule out inflammation, because VKH and posterior scleritis may present or may masquerade as a CSR in this for us. And when we do a slit lamp examination and see the cells, we will be able to pick up that this is an inflammatory pathology. And the next logical thing to do in these patients would be a fluorescein angiography, which will show you the pinhead size leaks. And for treatment for these patients would be steroids, and they will do very well with the steroids. That's why it's very important to differentiate these patients. This is another patient who presented with decrease in vision and was suspected as CSR. Here again, the fluorescein angiography helped us to diagnose an idiopathic CSR, and this patient did well with anti-VEGF treatment. However, OCT is a very valuable tool, not only to monitor these patients, we'll also be able to pick up the PEDs. The other eye pathologies can also be found out using the OCT. And when we monitor these patients serially, we will not only see the reduction in the height of the SRF, but also reduction in the area of the CSR on-face imaging. The imaging has very important role. The newer classification has been proposed by the Central Serous Chorioretinopathy International Group. This was published last year. They are proposing a classification of classifying the CSCR into 3 types: the simple, complex, and the atypical type. And further, the simple and the complex have been classified as primary, recurrent, and resolved. They also have proposed major criteria and minor criteria. Most of these are based on imaging. So the imaging plays a very important role in CSCR patients. We have to look for the increased choroidal thickness in these patients, because it's also considered as a part of the pachychoroid spectrum. Reduction in thickness can be seen on serial follow-ups in our patients. However, FFA has got a very important role when it comes to managing these cases. So it will help us to identify the exact leak. This is a patient showing an in-blot type of a leak, while this is the classical smokestack appearance on FFA. Chronic CSCR patients will reveal these kind of tracks, while autofluorescence will help us to show the various stages of a CSCR from early stage to late stage, and various changes that are happening can be picked up in this using the autofluorescence. And near infrared FAF is more sensitive for CSCR than the conventional short length FAF. Coming to the management, most of these patients do very well on observation. However, some patients who are having recurrent CSR or highly symptomatic may need to be treated after FFA or ICG. For extrafoveal leak, a green laser works very well. For subfoveal leaks, one may have to consider a half-dose PDT. And high-density subthreshold micropulse laser also is found to be of use in some of these patients. As far as the use of mineralocorticoid is concerned, it's of modest use in patients of acute CSCR, while eplerenone has not found to be superior to a placebo when it was tested in chronic CSCR patients. It's important that we watch out for hyperkalemia when you are using these mineralocorticoid receptor antagonists. Antioxidants again don't have a big role, but they may fasten the resorption of the fluid in some of the studies. This is what has been described. However, there's no role for the NSAIDs in management of CSR. However, they have a very important role in the management of the cystoid macular edema, which results from a final common pathway of many intraocular diseases. The etiologies include the inflammatory and the non-inflammatory cases, and most of the times we'll be treating the inflammatory CME. As far as the definitions are concerned, you may classify them as clinical CME, wherein they have a detectable visual impairment, while the patients with angiographic CME don't have a decrease in vision. Patients again can be classified as early CME, late CME, and chronic CME depending on their presentation. And the working classification here would be to treat them as post-surgical and non-surgical. The diagnosis is easy. However, when it comes to management, we need to answer this question: why this patient has developed a cystoid macular edema? So one needs to look for operation-related causes like complications during the surgery, a PCR, a vitreous loss, retained cortex, or a decentered IOL, and look for patient factors like compliance to the treatment that we give postoperatively and for comorbid conditions. However, it's important to remember that it can happen after a perfectly done surgery, and we have to look at inflammation more carefully by using a good slit lamp with room light turned off. And when we see correctly, we may be able to identify the exact inflammation in these patients, and we need to treat accordingly. Now, how do you proceed? Do you proceed based only on clinical findings, or do you need to do an OCT? Well, it's important that we do a OCT in these patients because some of them may have a vitromacular traction which was not seen before the cataract surgery. And if there is a vitromacular traction, we have to subject these patients for a surgery rather than putting them on medical treatment. We can also try to differentiate the types of CME from diabetic macular edema. In pseudophakic CME, we usually see the inner nuclear cysts, and there will be absence of hard exudates and other associated features. When it comes to management, we need to understand two things. One is the prophylaxis, other is the treatment. As far as the prevention is concerned, NSAID alone is better than steroids, or we can use NSAIDs along with combination in these patients. So for treating, it's different. For preventing, NSAIDs is recommended. And which NSAID is better? As far as the studies are concerned, ketorolac has got a better prostaglandin E2 inhibition and better penetration into the anterior chamber. However, the other two are more commonly used because of better market penetration. As far as management is concerned, there is no standardized treatment protocol, but usually we follow a stepladder pattern. We start with topical steroids and NSAIDs, and important that we add an ointment at night time. It works well in these patients, and if it doesn't work, after a 4 to 6 week period, one may consider a subtenance injection. Later, one may consider intravitreal implants or injection can also be considered in these patients. So for treatment, combination would be better than treating them with NSAID or steroids alone. As far as anti-VEGF use in CME is concerned, these two can be considered only in patients with non-infectious CME. And in patients with RP, retinitis pigmentosa, the oral acetazolamide has got the strongest evidence to date. However, dexamethasone implant is showing some promising results. So the take-home message is to identify patients with higher risk of CME, those who are having a complicated cataract, patients who are on treatment for glaucoma, and those who have systemic diseases. So we need to stop the prostaglandin analogs, have the steroid cover before this surgery, and consider anti-VEGF in patients with DME. So a stepladder pattern works very well in these patients. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Ravi, for making this job simpler, because you see, CSR is, the more we know, the less we understand actually. You see, CSR is a part of this ever-expanding spectrum of pachychoroid, and believe me, I think J.H. Shiblani has done a lot of work on this, and he was part of this international group what he has proposed recently and has been published and accepted in this journal. Any questions, Raju? Anybody?
Sir, is there any, if we diagnose pachychoroid and if we have a simple CSR, is there any difference in management in regards to that?
Raju?
No, I don't think our management would vary very much. As far as the management is concerned, we would follow the same protocol. Only thing, it helps us to see whether it is getting reduced with observation of what is happening to it. If it is persisting, then one may have to consider doing an ICG and then take further course of treatment for these patients. That's what I would think is the only difference. Otherwise, I hardly try to look at choroidal thickness in more importantly. Your take, sir?
I think for a chronic CSR with subfoveal leaks, and you see nowadays that PDT is not available in our country, 40% is not there. So, do you prefer micropulse or you still give a trial of mineralocorticoid?
For chronic, right now I do not have access to the micropulse laser, so I tend to give mineralocorticoid in these patients, sir.
Yeah, I am aware of this aptly renowned study where it was documented that it is no better than a placebo.
Correct.
My personal experience says that it does benefit in more than 60% of patients of CSR. Although long-term treatment will be required, and after a couple of weeks of stoppage of epinephrine, patients tend to come back. Yes, Dinesh, you were saying something.
Yeah, I was going to say that if you have what looks like pachychoroid disease, like if you have a chronic CSCR, and if you see that the RPE has these shallow multiple abnormalities, then an OCT angio is worth doing, and you may find that some of these patients actually have a neovascular process going on.
Yeah,
And these patients, there is a role for an anti-VEGF, and I would prefer aflibercept.
agreed. That is agreed, because you see, whenever in doubt, you see, you should do Opta in all these patients to rule out CNVM, and we have become wiser in picking up some of them, so-called quiescent kind of CNVM in these patients, and these melt away with the aflibercept. There's no doubt. I think we'll proceed because there are a lot of talks still remaining, and the next talk is by Dr. Dinesh Talwar on CNVM, how to suspect and how to manage in the best possible way in the current scenario. So time is around 10 minutes, Dinesh.
So choroidal neovascularization, we all know, is basically these are abnormal vessels growing under the RPE, breaking through it and reaching the subretinal space. It could be because of ARMD, high myopia, could be inflammatory, and could be idiopathic. But most of the stress is on age-related the process, because that causes most of them. Well, basically, the choroidal neovascularization causes a leakage of fluid, which goes under and into the retina or into the subretinal space, or causes subretinal or sub-RPE hemorrhage, and that results in a visual loss. What you see over here is a large sub-RPE hemorrhage, and what you see over here is a subretinal hemorrhage. Now, this smaller subretinal hemorrhage is more dangerous than this large sub-RPE hemorrhage in terms of vision loss. Now, when it comes to classification, we do topographic classification into juxtafoveal, extrafoveal, and subfoveal. And that's important because extrafoveal lesions can be treated by laser. And if you have juxtafoveal and subfoveal lesions, then pharmacotherapy is the mainstay of treatment. It's also good to do an angiographic classification because it gives you an idea of how these eyes are going to behave. In a classic CNV, you have early hyperfluorescence, which becomes very severe in the very blurred edges and more intense in the late phases. Or you could have an occult CNVM, which has no leakage in the early phase, but becomes late leakage comes up in the later phases. Or you can have an RPE detachment, which has the hyperfluorescence coming from the early phases and becomes more intense, but the margins remain well-defined in the late phase. Now, nowadays, what we follow is a morphological classification into the type 1, type 2, and type 3. And type 1 is basically when it arises under the retina, under the RPE, sorry. And this is what you see over here. Type 2 is when it rises above the RPE, as you see in this patient. And type 3 is when it arises in the substance of the retina and then goes downwards, proceeds towards the RPE, that's a retinal angiomatous proliferation. The important thing is that untreated choroidal neovascularization will usually progress to almost 6 lines vision loss over a period of 2 years, with the classic lesions behaving worse in a faster period and the occult lesions behaving a little slower, but finally they also cause loss of vision. So when you have a patient where you are not sure, if you want to detect, the easiest way is to do a fluorescein, is to do an OCT, and if you find any changes, then do a fluorescein angiography for characterization, which tells you the subtype and whether it's extrafoveal or subfoveal. This is just to give you an example of how a lesion which is well-defined extrafoveal can be completely destroyed by a laser without any adverse effects, and that's still a mainstay of treatment for these patients. However, for subfoveal and juxtafoveal lesions, well, the gold standard till now has been ranibizumab, but now aflibercept is catching up for this. And the treatment is with at least 3 loading doses in all active lesions on fluorescein angiography and OCT with any level of visual acuity. Even if the visual acuity is low, I would give a chance with the first 3 injections. Now, how do you manage these patients? Once you've given the first 3 injections, is check up the vision, and at that time, check up whether the lesion is dry on OCT. If the lesion is dry, the patient just needs monthly follow-ups, and no occurrence occurs in the next 3 months, you can now extend the follow-ups also to 6 weeks, then 8 weeks, then 10 weeks, and progressively to a maximum of 12 weeks. If, however, any recurrence occurs during this period, then I would consider PRN treatments with monthly follow-ups continuing and month monitoring to continue. This is just to show you, and why this is important, because it's not necessary that every patient will keep on needing injections. Now, for example, this patient got a little bit of, was okay, got a little bit of subretinal fluid, was treated, and next 5 months the patient was all right. So every patient who has some fluid doesn't need to be treated month after month. And if you take on treat and extend, you may end up giving them lots and lots of injections. However, treat and extend regime could be an acceptable alternative in a one-eyed patient who has a dry lesion after their treatment also. Other important thing is, if the patient is requiring PRN treatment with ranibizumab on a less than 8 weekly basis, say every 6 weeks he's needing an injection, consider a PRN with aflibercept. The second group of patients are those whom you, after the first 3 injections, find that the vision has improved or is stable, but the lesion is not yet dry. So a little bit of fluid is still there, intraretinal, not going down, or subretinal, just stable. Now, if this is so, you would continue monthly till the patient becomes dry. And if in the next 3 months the lesion dries up, the treatment is the same as for a PRN treatment. But if it does not dry up and it stays stable, now in these patients, you can consider using a treat and extend regime. Extend from 4 weeks to 6 weeks to 8 weeks to 10 weeks. And if the lesion remains stable, you can go up to 12 weeks. With aflibercept, you can even go up to 16 weeks. If you started off with ranibizumab and the patient is staying stable, you could give a trial of aflibercept to see how the patient is behaving. Now, if you've given, now this is happening very frequently, if you've given the initial 3 loading doses of aflibercept and the patient becomes dry, you follow the same regime. But if it's stable, this patient will need to be put on a treat and extend regime, and you have to see whether you can get a greater than 8-week interval in these patients. If you don't get that, revert back to ranibizumab. So this is just to show you a patient who, after the initial injections, continued to receive injections every 4 to 6 weeks, and therefore had to be maintained on. Then we gave her a try of ranibizumab also. So if I'm needing to give aflibercept every 6 weeks or 4 weeks, I would actually prefer to try with ranibizumab again in those patients. Now, just to sum this up, if the lesion is dry, try treat and extend ranibizumab. If your treat and extend ranibizumab is more than 6 weeks, continue the same. If it's not able to continue at up to 8 weeks, go to treat and extend aflibercept and see whether you can maintain on that. If you have a patient who started with a stable lesion but not dry, continue treat and extend aflibercept. If you are able to get more than 8 weeks, stick to aflibercept. If you're not able to get that, try Lucentis. If I have to use both aflibercept and ranibizumab 4 to 6 weekly, I would prefer to use ranibizumab in that. Now, There are cases where sometimes initial loading dose of ranibizumab given, and now PRN ranibizumab is being given every 6 weekly. Now try this patient on PRN aflibercept. And this is what was done here. The patient was given aflibercept and it resolved. So it helped to give us a rescue in these patients. And then we could maintain him back on ranibizumab. Of course, if you have non-responders, please do rule out polypoidal choroidal vasculopathy. Suspect it when you have any case of very large hemorrhages or very large exudation in the macular area. When you do the OCT of these patients, you'll find they have peaked RPE detachments. They have shallow undulating RPEDs along with them, and often with a double layer sign. There's another line within that. So this is an indication that you're dealing with PCV, and these patients may be better dealt with by either a combination of PDT with ranibizumab or with aflibercept. There are certain situations where you're not going to treat. If I have a patient like this, macular scar worsening to the point the vision is less than 3/60, there's no indication for treatment. If you have this kind of scar which is formed and these are cold hemorrhages, again, there is no indication for any further treatment. But if you have, keep it in mind, if you have a non-progressive occult lesion, dense RPD, vision 6/6, I would not treat this patient unless I have definite evidence of progression. The mean outcomes after treatment with anti-VEGF drugs are very good for the next 2-3 years, and up to 10-letter improvements occur. But over a period of time, 5 to 7 years, these patients will start losing vision. But still, the outcomes, at least 1/4 of your patients will have better than 6/12 vision, and you would be able to get better than 6/18 in 1/3. The important thing is that ongoing treatment would be continuing in half of your patients. So the important thing is, it's a lifelong disease. Monthly follow-ups are essential till the lesion heals, and then 3 monthly follow-ups, lifelong. High index of suspicion for retreatment is needed. If you have a loss of BCVA, even small amount, OCT evidence of fresh fluid or persistent fluid, increase in central retinal thickness, any new hemorrhage. So that's why fundus examination is critical. Or even if the surgeon subjectively feels that the macular fluid is increasing, you need to treat these patients. Ladies and gentlemen, eternal vigil is the price we pay for maintaining vision in these patients. And if we do that, we can save the vision of a lot of our patients for a long, long time. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Dinesh, for lucidly telling the management of this very difficult entity, CNVM. Not easily possible to cover in 10 minutes, but I think you have done great justice to it. 1 or 2 questions from the panel.
Yeah, just a comment which I'd like to add, I mean, just an extension of Dr. Dinesh's logic, and with relevance to that fluid study. So sometimes if in the course of treatment, while on TNE, if I notice that a CNVM has additional geographic atrophy, which is approaching the fovea, then as you mentioned, my choice would be to skip over to ranibizumab rather than go a very aggressive RP, stronger drying up drug, than aflibercept. So I might move the patient on to that.
And then that is a little bit controversial, but though that is your preference, because now when you are allowing the wet component also to be left untreated, there are two problems there. Dry one, which is anyway progressing, and now you're not addressing the wet one adequately.
No. I'm saying not that I would not treat. What I'm saying is my preference would be to a drug which is strong, efficacious, but probably not as strong as aflibercept. There is minimal fluid.
The balance.
Just the balance.
As far as fluid is concerned,
it has to be treated.
No fluid is good for retina. That's what I believe.
That's what I'm saying.
Just because fluid study came in, they say SRF is more tolerable than the IRF, and this thing, and just because our drugs could not eradicate, so we say this fluid is more tolerable. So Dinesh, your views on this fluid?
I am clarifying very clearly. If the fluid can be removed entirely, remove it.
Absolutely.
If the fluid can't be removed, you saw that I mentioned. First step, remove the fluid completely. You can't remove it. Don't keep on running after it. Now stabilize it. it is the fluctuation which is worse for patients who have some fluid, rather than a certain amount of fluid being maintained for a long time. This has been shown. In fact, there's a study which showed that those patients who had the least amount of fluctuation of fluid had the best results. So if you can remove it, remove it. You can't remove it, don't try to remove it, run after it, but minimize the fluctuation.
What I'm trying to make a
And
point
that is why it's important not to try to run after the last bit of fluid.
What I was wanting was, in an attempt to dry, suppose these drugs don't work, Anand, would you try brolucizumab? Or
First of all, as a non-disclosure, I have not tried brolucizumab. I'm very skeptical about it. I'm just waiting for more evidence to come up. So it's also the same concern. I would try brolucizumab perhaps more in a a PCV case where I have large PVs to kind of take it. I know from the extension of the PLANET study how aflibercept was more useful. I would probably do it in those kind of cases. But for a minimal amount of fluid, if that's not going away.
What I was asking was a resistance fluid to all these drugs. Now, Dinesh, that PDT, we don't have access to PDT.
I'll give you one
second. Poverty is not there. And IPCV cases are, more often being diagnosed. And in such situations, what is your approach?
Yeah, I would use aflibercept. And let me, to clarify your point about brolucizumab, there is only one indication to my mind for brolucizumab. A patient whose vision is less than 618 has persistent intraretinal fluid which refuses to go away and is requiring injections 4 to 6 weekly with aflibercept.
So in the COVID era, maybe that can, when the patient, you don't want patient to keep coming every 4 weeks or so.
And believe me, that's a very rare situation.
I think we should move on because we have 3 more talks remaining. And the next talk we have in the pipeline is by none else than Dr. Anand, and will tell us about another very common condition where people, treat differently every time is about DME. And Anand will tell us how does he manage DME currently.
Thank you, Dr. Lalit. It's an honor and pleasure to be part of this IC. Are my slides visible?
Yeah, yes. Please carry on.
Yeah. So a quick word about the pathogenesis. We know that diabetes through hyperglycemia triggers a bunch of molecular pathways, and that induces a number of cytokines.
Your internet is.
Anand, the slides are stuck here.
Even his voice is.
Photocoagulation in the 80s.
Anand.
Hello?
Yeah, your slides are not moving.
Oh.
We are on the first slide only. That is heading.
Even his voice is not heard.
Can you restart? Or even the voice is not being heard.
I think his internet is unstable.
Yeah, maybe. So, Malika, shall we move on or?
Yeah, can we?
Yes, sharing.
Yeah.
Are you sharing? Can you see my slide now?
First slide is visible, first only.
Anand, we can't hear you also.
And unshare your slide and then share it again.
You stop sharing, Anand. Something wrong with the connectivity.
Okay, maybe the next speaker can come on.
Okay, Malika, can you come and start sharing?
Yeah, I've done it, sir. It's on.
Yeah, okay. About the approach to RVOs.
Yeah, so while Dr. Anand Rajendran is getting his slides ready, I'll speak on retinal vein occlusions. First, I would like to thank Dr. Lalit Verma for including me in this very popular course. This is the major risk factors for vein occlusions remain. The major risk factors remain hypertension, diabetes, and dyslipidemia, but also less commonly.
We cannot see your slides, Dr. Malika.
Sir, can you see Dr. Verma?
No, sir.
No,
we're not seeing.
But I am able to see. I'm stopping now.
Yeah, it is the same issue.
Restart the screen share, I think.
Now,
Yeah,
Yes,
now
we
I can
can
see.
okay. So the main risk factors remain hypertension, diabetes, and dyslipidemia, and less commonly are the homocystinemia, coagulopathies, and inflammation. And to remember, these patients are at higher risk for stroke and cardiovascular complications. A very important feature specific to RVO is glaucoma, which is very commonly coexistent and may be the risk factor causing RVO. So very detailed disc evaluation is required. And when you suspect glaucoma, refer to a glaucoma specialist to do perimetry and RNFL analysis. And once it is confirmed that they have glaucoma, avoid steroid intravitreal injections. And for managing the glaucoma, what you have to avoid is prostaglandin analogs and the alpha agonists, because these will increase the risk of recurrent macular edema with RVO. So a large proportion of my patients of RVO have glaucoma. These RVOs can be classified as central vein occlusion, ischemic or non-ischemic, hemicentral vein occlusions, which behave like CRVO, and the BRVOs, which can be major or just macular vein occlusions. With all these RVOs, the problems that we face are macular problems or neovascularization at the disc or in the periphery. But most ominously, iris new vessels and neovascular glaucoma with CRVO and HRVO. This requires a very high index of suspicion and vigilance. The highest risk is in the first few months, but even later on, non-ischemic cases can also progress and become ischemic type. And the risk especially increases when we stop giving anti-VEGF when the macular edema resolves. That is when they come in the second year with sudden onset of neovascularization iris. And then there are many associations with retinal vein occlusions, various arterial occlusions like cilioretinal artery occlusion, BRAO, as you see in the second picture here, the inferotemporal BRAO, and CRAO, where you see a diffuse infarct along with CRVO. Investigations, I will be discussing each of these. If you see the figure here, you see the ischemic edema, or the ischemic appearance on the OCT, which is very common in RVOs. The inner layers look opaque. Now, this is to show how fundus photography is very important. The left eye of a patient with macular branch vein occlusion has exudates. The right eye is asymptomatic superotemporal BRVO. We treated her over 4 years with once ranibizumab and then more recently with Deximplant. And the vision did not improve. Even the OCT did not improve. But if you see the fundus photographs over 4 years, the hard exudates have resolved. So this is very reassuring that, what we have been doing has helped the patient in some way or the other, and possibly the edema would have been worse if we had not treated. So this is very reassuring to the patient also to see this picture. OCT, of course, is very, very important. This is a BRVO with VMT. We started scatter laser for the proliferation, which increased the VMT. And while we were planning surgery, we saw that this had got released with visual improvement. So OCT is extremely important. Fluorescein documents the amount of capillary permeability and non-perfusion, especially useful in BRVO, where we are not clear about the diagnosis. After a few months, the fundus looks featureless, but vision is poor. You can see the non-perfusion, delayed filling of the affected vein, new vessels, and capillary non-perfusion. And also sometimes in opaque media with asteroid hyalosis or some vitreous hemorrhage, you can pick up new vessels and non-perfusion with fluorescein, which you cannot see clinically. But this doesn't apply to lens sclerosis, because lens sclerosis absorbs the exciting and the wavelengths of the fluorescein angiography. Also, you can detect unsuspected new vessels on the iris when you do an angiogram. Now, what is the advantage of OCT angiography over efflorescent angiography? It shows the non-perfusion areas better than fluorescent because there is no leakage which obscures the non-perfusion. And however, it cannot show, the disadvantage of OCT angio is it cannot show the leakage from the perifoveal network, so that it doesn't guide for where to do the laser. And it also doesn't show the mid-peripheral and peripheral new vessels. This is just to show how OCTA can show new vessels and non-perfusion, just like fluorescent. Now, coming to the treatment, anti-VEGFs remain the first line of treatment. We get excellent results with ranibizumab and aflibercept. And there is evidence to show that starting treatment very early gives very good visual results compared to late treatment. 70% will improve by 15 letters if you start within 2 months versus starting later than 2 months, when only 50% will gain that much of vision. Now, very interestingly, there are few studies only which compare the anti-VEGFs for RVO, unlike for AMD and DME. So this is one important study which tried to compare bevacizumab with aflibercept in CRVO, HRVO with 362 eyes, and they found that both were equivalent. There was non-inferiority of bevacizumab for vision improvement. However, the story was different if you see the structural improvement of macular edema. In the aflibercept group, over 50% of the eyes had complete resolution, whereas in the bevacizumab group, only about 25%. So it's only 50% of the eyes can complete in bevacizumab completely resolved compared to aflibercept. And then they tried to see whether switching has any benefit in the same group, and 49 out of 362 eyes that did not respond well to initial treatment was switched. Bevacizumab was switched to aflibercept, and aflibercept non-response was switched to Dex implant. So what you see is most of these non-responders were bevacizumab non-responders, 35 of 49, and they all had a good response on switching to aflibercept. Only 14 were non-responders to aflibercept, and their response was not documented to Dex implant. This was another study, LEVO study, which tried to compare aflibercept with ranibizumab and found that much fewer injections are required with aflibercept. As early as the first 6 months of treatment, that difference was obvious. And this has not been previously reported with CRVO. So there is a definite advantage to aflibercept use, even in RVO. Also, the same study found that not only was the number of injections less, but also there was a greater reduction of macular edema compared to ranibizumab with aflibercept. And ranibizumab and bevacizumab were not significantly different for CRVO, but bevacizumab was inferior to aflibercept for RVOs. This is a study which tried to see that if you have recurrences with ranibizumab or bevacizumab requiring injections every 4 weeks and you cannot extend the interval beyond 4 weeks, what happens if you switch them to aflibercept? And it was seen that immediately the treatment interval could increase from 5 weeks to 9 weeks with an average increase of 26 days. And not only was the interval increased, but there was a further improvement in vision by 6 letters and a decreased CRT by 152 microns. So here again, aflibercept has several advantages over the other two drugs. It increases the macular edema-free interval, minimizing treatment burden. So what is the role of steroids? It remains a second choice to anti-VEGFs, and I would use it when anti-VEGFs are contraindicated, as in recent cardiovascular events, pregnancy, and nephropathies, or when there has been a suboptimal response to 3 injections of anti-VEGF, or when there is a peripheral traction with active new vessels where anti-VEGF can cause increase of traction. There you must start laser and give a steroid, or cataract surgery is planned because their steroid will cover the inflammatory component. In vitrectomized eyes, it may have a long half-life, but aflibercept also does well in vitrectomized eyes. Steroids have to be avoided when we suspect glaucoma, which is very common in RVO, or when there is a history of intraocular infections or an immunosuppressed patient like history of CMV retinitis in HIV positive, or there's a large PC opening where it can come into the AC. Now, what is the role of lasers in vein occlusions? I think I'm running out of time. So while the BVO study did recommend laser for BRVO, there are more recent studies where at the time of the BVO study, there was no anti-VEGFs, but the recent studies have found no benefit for adding macular laser in terms of improvement in vision or reducing the number of injections. In CRVO, even the CVO study did not find any benefit. Now, importantly, follow-up of RVO requires not only vision, but IOP, especially for patients with CRVO and HRVO. There is a high risk of new vessels in the iris. So every visit, undilated iris examination and gonioscopy, so that we can pick up early neovascular glaucoma and treat in time. And very important to look at the fellow eye, because often there is an asymptomatic RVO in the other eye, as you see in this case. The right eye has a BRVO and the left eye has proliferation. In the young, it is usually idiopathic inflammation or inflammation secondary to other diseases, or blood dyscrasias, leukemias, oral contraceptive pills, or sildenafil use, and nowadays post-COVID and post-vaccine. Most of these patients are asymptomatic and do well, may require steroids if there is idiopathic. This is a post-COVID vaccine young lady with CRVO and inferotemporal BRAO, with rapid resolution of symptoms on oral steroids and anticoagulants. So should I continue for half a minute or stop?
Half a minute you can continue, but beyond that.
Okay, this is a case to show an elderly bilateral RVO, vitreous hemorrhage in the right eye, so I operated. The left eye had a CRVO which had just received an injection ranibizumab a day before coming to me. So we operated the right eye and it was found to have multiple BRVO. But as we finished surgery, patient complained of complete loss of vision in the left eye. And what we saw is that this CRVO had progressed to ischemic form with a massive edema which was not even covered in the field. We gave him again aflibercept and treated with PRP, but we lost that eye and it was only PL. So even after ranibizumab, you can have a conversion from a non-ischemic to ischemic CRVO. So this has to be always kept in mind. This is again a patient with left eye already having neovascular glaucoma, right eye CRVO, and if you see there is a pre-retinal hemorrhage. So I already knew the prognosis was very guarded, did an angio, there were no new vessels, but I did a PRP and aflibercept and Lucentis anyway, because I suspected it will progress. And despite our laser and anti-VEGF, you can see that in 2 months' time, he came back with neovascular glaucoma in this eye. So very, very high risk for neovascular glaucoma in CRVO. You have to be very vigilant.
I think we can stop here. I think there are a huge number of cases Mallika has, and you see, unfortunately, time does not allow, because this will be injustice to the other speakers.
Yes, yes.
But only, Anand, you are ready, or we go to Avnindra Gupta? Anand is there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Yeah, you can start loading. Mallika, only one question, Dinesh and Mallika also. You see, is Eylea becoming the #1 favored anti-VEGF? Because Dinesh also and you also stressed that somehow the potency, the interval, and is better with Eylea.
Yes, sir. Definitely.
The Vivo study and the Newton study, what we quoted.
So definitely, I mean, apart from those studies, it is in our day-to-day practice only that we realize that definitely the duration of action of aflibercept is much better than ranibizumab. So once we give that injection, we can easily call the patient back in 2 to 3 months. You cannot do with ranibizumab.
The second comment was about the laser in BRVO, although you see the recent studies after that, the brighter study which you quoted. The practical real world says that you see, specifically for BRVO at least, laser does work wonders. And yeah, Dinesh.
Let me clarify. Even in the brighter study, if you see the subgroup analysis, the group of patients who had a duration for more than 12 months, the monotherapy with ranibizumab was inferior to a combined therapy with ranibizumab and laser.
Yeah.
So the point I'm trying to make is that, yes, in an acute situation, it may not make a difference. But if you have a patient in whom you're not getting, if you're needing the injections again and again, you may have a better result by combining laser with anti-VEGF.
Yeah.
And that is coming through in the brighter study. I mean, it's I'm not quoting my own figures. My experience says the same, but the brighter study showed the same thing in their subgroup analysis.
Agreed. But somehow the projection has been as if pharmacotherapy alone is non-inferior to this thing. So
it's very good for the companies.
Let's move on to Anand Rajendran. I agree. Let's move on to Anand Rajendran to listen his talk on DME. Sorry, Mallika, for interrupting here.
I'm sorry. I should have timed it.
Yes,
Okay,
Anand.
is my screen visible now?
Yes, yes, perfect.
Okay, I'll just move up a little. So the management of DME has moved from the macular lasers of the 80s to the turn of the millennium, where steroids brought in pharmacotherapy, to the current anti-VEGF era. So the management challenges can be straight and simple, and the tough tackles will take the straight and simple first. So from the guiding principles and of the trials, the questions that come to us first is what works. So a number of trials have shown that Resolve for ranibizumab, Bolt for bevacizumab, Vista Vivid for Eylea showed that unequivocally anti-VEGFs all have high efficacy versus sham. But then the question, which one do we choose? What works best? So DRCR protocol 2 showed us that of the three, aflibercept and ranibizumab were better decidedly than bevacizumab, and then 2 years, and then 1 year aflibercept better than all three. And with macular edema, bevacizumab decidedly did the worst. So in poor vision patients, aflibercept and ranibizumab better, but if vision is better than 612, then you can use either of the three. Now, what works if the patient presents late? This is the main issue. If the patient is chronic, either untreated or with laser dyes. So just a case of a patient who would come in the early as part of the pandemic, a 63-year-old female with chronic diabetic hypertension, HbA1c is 8.5, vision 636, severe NPDR, DME at that point, came in 5 months late because of the pandemic delay. Again, vision was still 636, but you can see on the multi-color image, it's a little more hazy because there was a thin wispy hemorrhage, and you can actually see that on the OCT also, more of the dots. HbA1c had worsened a bit. PDR with DME, we instituted PRP and ranibizumab. Over 6 injections, over 8 months of ranibizumab, equity improved. So what's important to note is that even if the patient is chronic, the 6-month interval, which was the textbook definition, does not hold. You should go in with anti-VEGF therapy. So does this have precedence in literature? So it turns out that Rice and Wright did show this very much in their study when they looked at ranibizumab arms versus sham. They showed that for patients who did not get ranibizumab for 2 years, equity hardly went off the baseline. The moment they were given ranibizumab after 2 years, equity graph started snaking up. And also with macular edema, there was a dramatic, almost magical reduction in the macular edema once these patients were allowed after 2 years. Case 2, this is a patient who was lasered. You can see those faint spots on the multi-color image and on the IR image also. 6-7-year-old male lasered elsewhere, equity 660, status quo looking at his old scans. 2 months later, again, the pandemic delay came back with slight drop in vision, 5/60. And you see that over 5 injections, 7 months, 4 ranibizumab, last one being bevacizumab, equity improves beautifully. And what is even more impressive is that the ELM and the ellipsoid zone also have improved from here to this point. So there is a resilience of the ELM and the EZ to improvement, and you should definitely put an anti-VEGF. So again, turns out there is a precedence in literature. The Restore shows this very same thing when we combine the ranibizumab alone was ranibizumab combination versus the blue line, which is lasered alone. Again, for 1 year, patients who are not treated with anti-VEGF, as soon as they were allowed anti-VEGF, the graph starts snaking up, and to the point that at 3 years, it catches up with the ranibizumab combination now. So the corollary is, do not delay, put in that anti-VEGF as soon as you can, and it doesn't seem to make a difference whether you put in that anti-VEGF at the start or 1 year later. At 3 years, you end up in the same place. Also, the reinjection rates were similar. So the USP of laser for reducing the number of reinjections doesn't seem to hold good here. So then what else worked? What about the role of lasers and steroids? So protocol I tried to answer that. It looked at ranibizumab, deferred laser versus prompt laser versus laser only and IVTA prompt laser, and found that the ranibizumab did far better. And of the two, the deferred laser did better at 2 years, at 3 years, and at 5 years, and also in terms of reduction of macular edema. Now, what about reinjection rates? Turns out that you have to go hard in the first year. So in both the arms, 8 and 9 injections in the first year resulted in a dramatic drop in number of reinjections in the subsequent years. So get a grip on that disease earlier. And up to 43% of patients required no injections retreatment in the year 3. So issues were there, elevated intraocular pressure glaucoma only for the IVTA arm, and cataract surgery also. More than half the patients required cataract surgery. So what about the regimens? So there's the monthly dosing, this PRN, which is criteria based, and then you treat and extend. So obviously, monthly dosing gives you the best efficacy, but it comes with all these problems: economic burden, not practical, infection risks, time issues. PRN dosing is anti-VEGF administered based on PRN strict criteria. Changes in equity and OCT are used. Retain study was the first one which looked at this treat and extend regimen. They compared it to PRN and they found that it was comparable to PRN. So that was about how to treat. Now stepping back a little, how do we assess that patient in front of you? So you look at the clinical profile, fundus picture, OCT, FFA features, and equity of that eye. Also factor in fellow eye status, systemic profile, rule out masqueraders. Look at the dosing history, posology. Was it adequate? What was the drug used? What was the dosing strategy used? What are the patient factors? Very important in our setup, compliance and financial issues. Then I've grouped these together as the mitigating factors, the clinical factors. RP degeneration, macular atrophy, thinning, subfoveal fibrosis, macular ischemia, poor vision for me, less than equal to 3/60, loss of the ellipsoid ISO's integrity, the ORT's drill, sign of chronicity, and the surgical factors, epiretinal membranes or macular atrophy. These you desist from a very aggressive treatment strategy. Encouraging factors being pure clean edema with or without subretinal fluid, suboptimal vision 618 to 4/60. So examples of this: macular ischemia, subfoveal fibrosis, hard exudates in the macula, outer retinal tubulations, macular atrophy, drill, and the surgical factors, macular traction and epiretinal membranes. Now in the fellow eye, as I said, look at that too. It's good vision, desist from aggressive treatment strategy. One-eyed patient can pursue an aggressive treatment strategy. Systemic factors to be ruled out: glitter zones, which can cause edema, nephropathy, hypertension, anemia, stroke, myocardial infarction, allergies. So this is a gross treatment strategy. Monthly injections, still the patient is stable, which means equity, OCT unchanged for 2 to 3 visits. Then if the mitigating factors are there, wait and extend. If the encouraging factors are there, go for treat and extend. In both cases, if it's stable, you can extend the follow-up to 3 months. If it's unstable, go back to treat and extend. Now for the tougher cases, these were the straightforward cases. If the dosing is adequate and you have given adequate and still the patient is refractory, then what do? You switch over. So this is a case example of a patient who was on Avastin, was refractory, flattened with Accentrix. This is a more common situation than this situation where a patient was refractory to Accentrix and then benefited from Avastin, but this has happened rarely. But there are enough studies which show that ranibizumab and aflibercept have been useful in switching and reducing macular edema. But the million-dollar question that comes up now is there a role of steroids at all in this anti-VEGF era? So it turns out that the MEAD study answered that Ozurdex 0.7 milligram improved significantly patients in LPG patients previously treated with other modalities. Very interesting study on looking at the basic architecture by Huang et al. Association between hyperreflective dots on SD-OCT and macular edema response to treatment. So they looked at a bunch of patients who were treated with bevacizumab, 3 injections, and they found that the HRD number dots were more in bevacizumab non-responders than responders. 75% of the bevacizumab non-responders responded to Ozurdex, as you can see here. And interestingly, it is the converse. The HRD number was more in the Ozurdex responders than non-responders. And they said that it was probably because it was a marker of inflammation, and therefore there was a subclinical inflammation going on with microglia and other cell debris being perpetrated. So they suggested a therapeutic role on the basis of this for steroids in anti-VEGF non-responders. What about anti-VEGF versus steroids again? Bevacizumab looked at that, and they found that when you look at equity, definitely bevacizumab did far better than Ozurdex at the end of 104 weeks. But if you look at the subset of pseudophic patients, then dexamethasone did as well as bevacizumab. And also, you see in the third graph that steroids help you get the control and reduction of the macular edema much faster. Although at 104 weeks, they end up at the same point. So it's a decent option in pseudophics. Finally, Boyer's study showed that a very good role, and probably this is the USP of Ozurdex. Nothing works as well as Ozurdex in vitrectomized eyes because the dynamics is different. So if dosing is adequate, you can use Avastin to Accentrix or aflibercept or Ozurdex, as the MEAD study showed you. Elderly pseudophics, IVT and Ozurdex, especially in vitrectomized eye. Now the question, does adding steroids to anti-VEGF help? Well, Protocol U looked at that to their credit, and they found that adding dexamethasone to ranibizumab did not offer significant value in terms of equity improvement. Sohail and Wang also showed that adding IVT to Avastin offers no significant advantage. We have also seen cases like that. Now with repetitive anti-VEGF therapy, one side advantage is that the background retinopathy can also improve, and this has been shown in both ranibizumab and aflibercept. It's important that we rule out masqueraders such as hypertension, MACTEL, X-linked retinoschisis. New laser systems have come in, micropulse subthreshold laser like the yellow 577. Duty cycle use is 5%. There's contiguous treatment of macular edema, which is possible. Less RP damage, doesn't show up on autofluorescence and microperimetry. So finally, other alternatives that we can use and have been used to inject at increased frequency, use dose hike, drug cocktail, drug way, limited without peel, but I haven't really found the pulse laser at a 5% duty cycle. UVN is something we don't have in our hand, but is useful. Thank you.
Thank you, Anand, for the very, very wonderful talk. Again, this similar question, you see, all of you, RVOs, DMEs, ARMDs, the tilt, I think, is moving towards aflibercept everywhere. Whether you talk of protocol T or what Malika showed, and even Dinesh was also. So, is the effectivity or the interval you are impressed with here, or the potency?
So actually, I mean, protocol T kind of answered that question for us. So if the patient's vision is worse than 612, then you could use either, because in the long term they seem to end up at the same place. But if it's better, then you could use either of them. So that kind of answered for DME. For me, it's not so much of a distinction. But yes, we should keep in mind that at 1 year, aflibercept definitely showed a p-value advantage over ranibizumab. So if the patient is capable of paying, and now with this new Eylea for You program, possibly I would go for aflibercept.
Can I ask a question to Dr. Anand?
Yeah, please.
Anand, if you see high reflective spots, whatever that is, would you, just because of that study, would you proceed with steroid, or would you still try anti-VEGFs? Because much importance.
Thank you. So it was actually a small study, but they did it in a very good way, and they used Avastin. It was all of them were bevacizumab responders, non-responders. So we know that ideally, I would love to see the same study being done with aflibercept, and to see whether that could. See, we know that it reduces it the least. So
yes,
that would be great.
Yeah, the message should not be that if you see hyperreflective dots,
Correct.
just steroids.
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely. I think that's basically, we know that bevacizumab does not respond, does not treat DME as well as ranibizumab or aflibercept dots.
Yes.
Even the protocol T shows that very, very clearly. 67 micron versus 119 micron was the thickness. So the difference in the amount of fluid removed. So that's
also the protocol I mean, that was there for us, ranibizumab versus IVTA. You could argue that they used IVTA and not Ozurdex, but at the same time, it's the same thing. There they used IVTA. In this study, which is a smaller study, they used bevacizumab.
Let's
this was a very small study. Yeah, we have to move on.
Last talk, because I think 10 minutes are remaining, and we'll request Avneet to tell us about these very, very common surgical entities, ERM and macular hole, when to operate and how to operate. Yes, AG. Avneet, are you there? Yeah.
Can you hear me, sir?
Yeah. No, everything is good.
Can you see my screen, sir?
Yeah, carry on.
Thank you, sir, for giving me this chance of speaking in your instruction course. What I'll be talking is approach to epiretinal membrane and macular hole. I think I'll have to stop share and share again. Sir, ये आगे नहीं बढ़ रही है.
I think you have to.
No, I think the host sometimes is shutting down the video. I had that problem. So
Also had it.
could you please enable Dr. Abhindra? We are seeing your screen,
Yeah,
Dr. Abhindra.
now it's okay.
Okay.
ERM was first described by Ivanov in 1865. 2% of the patient above the age of 50, and 20% of the patient by 70 years get affected by epiretinal membrane. Bilateral involvement occurs in 10 to 20% of the patient. Beaver Dam study, which was an OCT-based study, showed prevalence as high as 34.1%. In 2016, the preferred practice guidelines for epiretinal membrane over a period of 5 years showed 29% of the ERM progressed, 26% regressed, and 39% remained stable. So what we see is only 1/3 of the patient will require surgery and 2/3 of the patient will not require surgery. So don't jump over surgery once you see ERM. Follow this patient for at least 3 to 6 months and see whether they are stable or progressing. Coming to the causes of ERM, usually it is idiopathic. Clinical features, usually it is asymptomatic. 5% will have vision of less than 660, reduction in vision, and metamorphosia is the major complaint in advanced epiretinal membrane. You will have mild sheen, what you see here, and there will be a vascular tortuosity. The arcades will be straightened. The vessels are straightening. In advanced cases, there will be a stria and heterotropia of the macula, intraretinal hemorrhages, and cystic changes in the macula. OCT is the best diagnostic tool to diagnose epiretinal membrane. FA shows leakage in the late phase. Coming to the treatment part, asymptomatic ARM with good vision, no treatment is required. Symptomatic ERM, that is vision is less than 624. The patient is complaining of metamorphosia. If the ERM is thick, then it requires pars plana vitrectomy with epiretinal membrane. If you can document there is a sequential decrease in vision, that patient is eligible for surgery. Now, this is one of the patient. You can see on OCT, there is a loss of foveal contour and a thick epiretinal membrane, altering the shape of the retina. We took this patient for surgery. And first the vitrectomy is done. You can see a thick epiretinal membrane covering the foveal area. It's important in the epiretinal membrane surgery to create an edge, and how we create this edge is with 25 gauge MVR blade. So once the edge of the epiretinal membrane is created, half of the surgery is done. This is the most difficult part of the surgery. And once the edge is created, you take an Eckart forceps and start peeling the membrane. The traction, what you put on the membrane should not be anterior, posterior. It should be a tangential traction. Many a times you don't know the extent of the epiretinal membrane, so you need to put dye. In this case, I have used BBG dye, and I can see delineate the membrane, and then I pick up this membrane and gradually peel it tangentially. You can
Sir,
see.
with all due respect, sir, the time for this session is over. So I would request you to please sum up within the next 2 minutes, as we have another session to start at 2 o'clock.
Okay. So what
Thank
you
you,
can
sir.
see, I'm removing the membrane here, and the membrane is removed in total. Post-operative picture, you can see here the foveal contour has returned back, and the patient improves to 618. This is another patient post VR surgery, and what we have done, we do a fluid air exchange, and many times you are not able to see. We put a retiblue dye. This helps us to delineate the extent of epiretinal membrane. And once the edge is created, then you catch hold of the epiretinal membrane with the help of the Eckart forceps and pull it gently and tangentially, and whole of the membrane comes in one go. Improvement in visual acuity occurs by 2 lines in 74%. No improvement occurs in 24% of the patient. There is a controversy whether you should remove the ileum along with epiretinal membrane. Liu et al. Performed a meta-analysis of ERM surgery with and without ileum peeling. Patient who underwent ileum peeling had better visual acuity at 12 months. By 18 months, no significant difference in both the groups. Microperimetry showed better results in non-ileum peeling eye. I won't go to the prognostic factors.
Yeah, you can come to macular hole surgery.
Yeah. Coming to the treatment of macular hole, medically, it can close spontaneously. Intravitreal oculoplasmin was tried, but the results are not very encouraging, and few patients had decrease in vision, and the cost was exorbitant. So intravitreal oculoplasmin is not being used. Macular hole can be classified less than 400 microns, 400 microns, and failed macular holes. And this is one of the patient, what you can see here. We have done a tricot staining and PVD was induced. This is a macular hole with an epiretinal membrane. Once you have put the BBG, you can see this whole area has not got stained with the BBG dye. So we know that there is an adjunct, there is an associated epiretinal membrane. So we use a diamond dusted to create an edge, and this epiretinal membrane is peeled. So once this epiretinal membrane is peeled, we do a restaining of this area, and you can see again whole of the hilum gets stained. You can see whole of the hilum gets stained here. So now we create an edge with the help of a diamond dusted, and we peel the membrane. Generally, depending on the size of the hole, we decide whether we have to go for an inverted technique or we have to go for an full no inverted technique. So in this case, I do an inverted technique and leave the flap adjacent to the macula, and then I enlarge the hilum peel. This is one of the cases of failed macular hole, and I have done this surgery, and you can see the size of the macular hole is 1785 microns. It's a huge, large macular hole which has failed, and we took this patient for surgery. And the vitrectomy was done, the BBG was put, and I was planning to do a bimanual surgery, so additional Sandia light is put. Once the BB is cleared, you can see the large hilum peel which I have done previously. So I initiate the hilum peel, and once the hilum peel is initiated, I put a PFCL, because if I don't put a PFCL, this hilum will keep on
Sir, I would
roaming.
request you to please sum up, as it is already 2 and we need to start with the next session.
Okay. And this is one thing. What we did, we removed the PFCL, and simultaneously what we did, we injected colored visco to stabilize the hilum flap, and then with the help of a 40 gauge needle, we created a detachment to mobilize the retina, and you can see we have closed the hole. The vision improved to 624.
Okay, I think with this, we thank all the speakers for the wonderful presentations, and sorry for some miscalculation of the time. And we will see all of you physically as soon as possible. And thanks to Dr. Bertley for joining us and being patient with us for listening to. Hope you enjoyed the webinar, Dr. Bertley.
Very much. Yes.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, doctors. I really appreciate that you have winded up the session exactly on time.
Thank you, Malika. Thank you, Dinesh. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Dr.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.